So, I saw Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny today, and it's fine. It's fine. It kicks off with a really fun prologue and a de-aged Harrison Ford that's mostly okay. Then the film becomes a bit bloated and all over the place in its plot, but ultimately has decent set pieces, delivers a theme that works, and isn't half as disrespectful to the original trilogy as people seem to be condemning it for. It's not a great film, but it's probably better than The Crystal Skull, and I am going to get into all of that. I think more though, I wanted to start this video by saying that it's far too easy to be cynical about a film like this. Much of which is the fault of modern film studios, because you remember just how perfectly Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade ended. Even Crystal Skull wrapped things up, to be fair to it, and then you remember how many sequels, prequels, spin-offs, soft reboots have been made in recent years, all as mostly nostalgia-driven cash grabs. Or at least that's the reputation they have garnered, as soulless cash grabs. And so a fifth Indiana Jones movie gets made, and I think everyone has already concluded what it will be like. Plus, Kathleen Kennedy has a reputation that makes people 10 times more cynical, and it leaves people going into this film looking for the absolute worst in it, and not being curious to understand aspects to it that aren't immediately clear. I think most people have lost faith in modern movies, or at least modern blockbusters, and that does naturally leave them less curious, more dismissive, more cynical towards new films. And there is reason for that. A lot of it is the fault of film studios over the last 10 or so years building up this reputation that is now causing them problems. Indiana Jones is a massive franchise, and yet so far no one has gone to see this film. People have lost faith, and that's understandable, but I think it's a shame when this general cynicism becomes the main discourse of film criticism itself. Ideally, good film criticism should be kind of nuanced, and I think when there is this general narrative of like soulless cash grabs or disrespecting source material or whatever, I feel like it's too easy for people to just fall into that narrative and then interpret everything from that lens, normally with a fair degree of bitterness.
Sitting through all 2.5 hours of this utter garbage was one of the most tedious, frustrating and depressing experiences I've ever had in a cinema. Absolute embarrassment of a movie that shames not just the franchise, not just the genre, but the entire concept of filmmaking.
Come on, that bad? Really? Let's discuss it all, okay? So I know people are probably going to be critical of me being critical of the Critical Drinker being critical of Indiana Jones, for which we'll all make this long chain of criticism, but that's fine. All the same, don't take this as an all-out attack on the Critical Drinker's channel. It's not the sort of channel that really appeals to me, but it does appeal to 1.72 million people, and I don't think there's anything wrong in that. The reason I'm making this is because I generally disagree with the reception this film is getting, and the Critical Drinker's video, Indiana Jones and the Destruction of Legacy, just happens to be the most obvious example for that reception. It makes for a really good jumping off point to discuss this, and yeah, to be fair, I think the Critical Drinker is often quite cynical. Anyway, the film. Most people agree this film's prologue is strong enough. Some people don't like the de-aging, I don't really mind it. I think the prologue has some fun action set pieces. I think it sets up Archimedes' dial as the main relic in this film. It sets up our villain in Jürgen Voller. But mainly the purpose of this prologue is the character Basil Shaw, played by Toby Jones, which in many ways is the heart of this film. An archaeologist friend of Indy's who is obsessed with the dial of Archimedes. They're both really good together, by the way. There's great chemistry, and Basil is a great foil to Indy. The prologue ends with this sunny shot of them walking up the hill towards the Allied forces, having explained that the Nazis are all but defeated by now, Hitler is in hiding, and Indy hands Basil one half of the dial that they've acquired. A jolly version of the iconic theme plays, Indy talks about going home, and it's a really optimistic moment. The war is pretty much over, the best of life is ahead of them. And then we later learn how terribly this dial kind of ruins Basil's life. He becomes obsessed with finding the other half to the dial, to the extent that Indy describes it as driving him mad. Very much fractures his relationship with his daughter Helena to the extent Indy takes it away again, in the hopes not having a dial will help Basil recover, but it doesn't. His obsession for lost history destroys him. And that's pretty cool when you think about how this film ends. Spoilers, by the way, these are big spoilers now. The dial gets put back together, it works, it's a time-travelling device that sends them and the villain back in time, but the calculations are wrong and they end up in ancient Greece, where Indy has also taken a gunshot wound. He's jaded, his son has died and his marriage to Marion has broken down, he's stuck now in ancient Greece, so he kinda decides he just wants to stay there. Possibly to die. There's only one chance to get back home and hopefully heal from his wounds, but he doesn't want to take it. Who would he be going home to? Where instead, ancient Greece. Indy has devoted his whole life to studying history, and now he gets to breathe it in, to stay there within a piece of history. Suddenly it's not just Basil's life that could be destroyed by the dial, but Indy's too. An obsession with the past that could destroy his present in just the same way. And I think that's a pretty cool dilemma to throw upon the character. I'll get back to the criticisms in a second. I know I'm mostly just explaining the story right now, but yeah, all of Indy's adventuring after the past, perhaps finally reaching a point where it might literally consume him. Or can he put something else first? Can he envision a life in the present day? Can he envision a future? Can he believe in something beyond? Which, kind of loosely, a little messy, I think is a struggle Indy has always had. In the first film, Marion is angry at him because he effectively ditched her for years to go off hunting treasure until the need of her father's medallion is what brings him back to her. And then during the film he leaves her tied up to be interrogated because he's worried setting her free too early would ruin his chance at getting the Ark of the Covenant. They later almost marry, but he breaks away again until they are reunited somewhat with the help of a son he didn't know he had in the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Indy's life's passion is built around the adventure for historical relics. I find it very believable in that sense that A, it would disrupt his family life, and B, that it would make an Indy who is too old to adventure anymore, that it would make him find it really difficult to settle down. He does feel too old to be adventuring at the start of this film, and I think that dissatisfies him. And then he is forced out onto one last hurrah, and yes, he's old, yes, he struggles at times with some aspects of it, but he realises he is still able to pull his weight. And that's really nice. Put a pin in that idea though, we're going to come back to that. This film begins with a very optimistic time, right at the end of the war, when all of life seemed ahead of them. Naturally, winning the war was a very good thing, but it was still this event that tore the world apart, and now somehow it has to try and rebuild again. While the younger generations are celebrating the hope of a new future via the Moon Day celebrations, Indy can't quite summon that optimism, to which the general consensus seems to be this.
Indy is now a broken, depressed old man living alone in a crummy New York apartment, divorced from Marion, about to retire from his job and with nothing left to live for. All we need now is for some plucky young female character to come into his life and show him the way.
Is this wrong exactly? No, I'm not going to completely argue against that criticism. I think, for example, it's very convenient their son died. I don't think Indy necessarily needs that extra traumatic reason for him to be a bit broken down this film. Arguably, they push him a little bit too far. But I also don't think this is the kind of broken down depiction that ruins all the optimism of the younger Indy. It's not like a cynical Luke Skywalker that then tarnishes the very hope his character was always meant to represent. No, I think this feels believable for Indy. He is a man whose life was consumed with adventure, for which it now leads to consequences in his old age when he struggles to adjust. The conflict between adventure and settling down has always been this part of his character, and the climax of this film forces him to make the ultimate choice on that. Well, almost make the choice. There is a very big criticism there I'm going to come to about the ending, but there's that. There's the fact I I don't think he's at all bitter towards the younger generations. His character here does not seem to believe all hope is gone from the world or anything like that, just that he personally is past it, that he doesn't have a place in the modern world, especially not when his family is broken apart. He now belongs as a relic of the past, as a piece of the very history that he nearly ends up trapped within. That's a great concept. He comes very close to literally becoming a piece of the history that he has always been chasing. That's a surprisingly tight metaphor for such a bloated film. Which is a side note, as much as people find the time travel bits absolutely ridiculous, I think every one of these films has been ridiculous and also ended with something supernatural. That's kind of part of the fun, isn't it? Yeah, it's a bit bonkers, but unlike Crystal Skull's ending, for example, the supernatural element is intrinsically tied to Indy's character here in a really nice way. So I don't mind the ridiculousness of it, mostly. Felt a bit too perfect that they would literally end up meeting Archimedes, but my point though was that he's not bitter towards the youth. In fact, he's almost like a protective father figure to Helena in places, as much as she's an absolute dick to him, which we'll also get to in a second. He's still trying to look out for her as much as he's trying to get the dial back. And when she's doing crazy things like jumping onto moving cars, he's horrified. He wants her to be careful, despite the fact these are stunts he has been pulling his entire life. So that's quite a nice conflict that they never quite make enough of in this film. He wants to take the risks so that his goddaughter can stay safe. She wants to take the risks because she thinks he's too old to succeed at them. To be honest, I think this is a film that has a lot of good little ideas they're there, they're just never executed brilliantly, and it does lead to all of them becoming a bit jumbled alongside each other. It does have that trouble. Doesn't make it the worst cinematic experience I've ever had though, nor does it make Indy this.
This absolute imposter is timid, gullible, naive, sad, depressed, weak, cowardly, clueless, and incompetent. This right here is Helena, yet another addition to the growing lineup of brunette, British, flawless, idealised Kathleen Kennedy self-inserts that are better than their ageing male counterparts in every possible way.
Come on, you don't really see Helena as flawless, surely. I mean... Yeah, she pulls all sorts of fancy stunts just like a younger Indy would have done, but that doesn't make her flawless, nor does it make him useless. He still pulls off decent stunts and fights and action. And the fact he is literally old, he's supposed to be 70. The fact she realistically would be more physically capable than a 70-year-old man doesn't make it an attack on his character. Indy still puts in a heroic physical effort for a man in his 70s. And she is flawed. She is arrogant for one. She thinks Indy will be useless compared to her because of his age. That is her mistake at the start of this film. That's the point. She learns the opposite. She realises how good Indy is. He does effectively help rescue them in Tangier. He fixes the car with chewing gum in a way that kind of gets back at them. He figures out about the water displacement puzzle. When she comes to try and rescue him at the end, he ends up saving her from falling to her death. And in fact, Indy becomes the leader of their little crew to the extent that Teddy even remarks on it, that Indy has taken over. Originally she wanted to be in charge, but he comes in and takes that role. How is that her being more capable than him being useless, you know? And to look at it from Helena's point of view, at first she wants to think of herself as capable on her own, and that is kind of her flaw. It's not whatever wish fulfillment you've imagined it being about Kathleen Kennedy as a self-insert or whatever. She is an orphan who hasn't seen her godfather for 18 years, clearly has spent a lot of her life surviving on cons, and then doesn't like the idea of Indy trying to father her. Of course she wouldn't. Of course, you know? Then she grows and comes to need him by the end of this film. Is that arc perfectly executed? Again, no, it's really messy. Most things in this film are, but it's still very clearly there. I'd say out of the two, Indy still comes across as the more capable character, despite his age. The only true, real moment where Helena takes charge is at the end of this film, when Indy has the choice to either go home or stay trapped in ancient Greece. He chooses to stay in ancient Greece, but she doesn't want him to die there, so she knocks him out, takes him home, and he wakes up in his bed. And I I really don't like that. It's the worst part of this film for me. It takes away his agency. I think she should have made more of an argument for him to come home, convince him, help him make the decision, not take away his own decision making. Like in The Last Crusade, Indy has the chance to get the Grail, but it risks his death. His father has to convince him to let it go. That's a beautiful moment, and it works because Indy still makes the decision. Here, he's just knocked out, and that's a real shame. I get it, because she lost her father to chasing this history effectively, and now she doesn't want to lose her godfather too. Arguably, you could even see that all as a metaphor for suicide, and it is kind of powerful, but knocking him out with a punch undermines that at the most emotional moment. It's really frustrating, so that's true, but it hardly makes her more capable and makes him useless or anything like that. Helena's biggest flaw is that she is kind of an inverted Indy, where he will stop at nothing to secure historical artifacts, she will stop at nothing to sell historical artifacts for her own money. All she cares about is money. Indy is an archaeologist where she is a con artist. He is a professor where she is a thief. And he looks down on her for that because he thinks his goddaughter can become so much more, which she does by the end. In fact, a lot of her cold, indifferent nature seems like a defense, and I think that's accurate. I think that's how Indy sees it. She's trying to pretend that she doesn't care and doesn't need anyone, and that causes her a lot of problems in this film. Despite Teddy, who is kind of short round version 2, she is lonely here. Even Indy, without his family, has contacts in Salah or Greek divers he can call on for support. All she's got is a long list of people she has scammed, including an ex who wants her dead. She gets to show how her skills could be a positive in the way that she tricks the villain Voller in the centre of the film, but generally her life has been a bit of a mess, caused by her flaws, and despite trying to appear aloof, she is deeply unhappy. Both her and Indy are unhappy people at the start of this film. I don't think it's accurate at all to see her as showing him up. Too often, I think modern film criticism takes minor nitpicks and then conflates them into massive film-ruining faults as a means to dismiss the entire movie as pathetic or a disgrace. For example, there's a contrived bit where Voller in this film seems to know our heroes will be going straight to Sicily on the basis that he sees their boat through binoculars and sees it heading west instead of east.
Because he grabbed a pair of binoculars and watched them escape the boat ambush, and because they weren't heading in the direction they claimed to be, he magically knew exactly what they were planning and where to find them.
Which, to be fair, does make some vague sense if you stop to reflect on it. If they're not heading east, it suggests the tomb they're looking for isn't in Alexandria but somewhere to the west. What locations in that direction might be linked to Archimedes that might then hold his tomb? Sicily is a good bet. So the villains go to Sicily and roam about hoping to find the heroes, to which they stumble upon Teddy and kidnap him for questioning. It's still not great, you know, he's not wrong there, but like in the first film for example, the villains there use a monkey as a spy to tell them some really convenient stuff. Who cares? It's a bit ridiculous. All the Indiana Jones films are deliberately a bit ridiculous. That's a big factor of why I love the original trilogy so much. They aren't afraid to not be too serious.
There's literally a conversation where Helena asks him if he knows how to fly a Cessna, and he replies that he's never flown one before, and then she replies that he's never flown any plane before. Why the fuck did you even ask him then, you absolute Cornish pasty?
Because that's not how the conversation went. She asks him if he thinks he could manage it, the implication not being that he knows how to fly the plane, but that he might be able to figure it out. And he replies, sure, but he says it nervously, and it puts her off the idea. It's not a reassuring response, to which he then says he's never flown one of those planes before, and she responds, you've never flown any plane. But she wasn't asking if he's ever flown one of these planes before, she's asking if he might know enough to have an idea about how to fly one, and when he doesn't sound confident about the prospect, she doesn't want him to risk trying. It's hardly brilliant dialogue, I am not going to argue that, but neither is it so painfully stupid as the drinker is suggesting.
Jesus, did anyone even read this script before they performed it?
And these are two of the big examples he uses in his video for arguing why the film is so horrendously bad, where everything else he says is mostly criticisms made without much evidence, and I don't know, I just feel like we do that too readily with film criticism nowadays. Not everything has to be either good or bad, it can be bits of both. Not every flawed film has to be something we should be deeply angered by either. Look, I don't know, this has gone on for long enough, this is way too lengthy a video for what it is, it was supposed to be something small. I equally am not saying the critical drinker, or the many others who are trashing this film, I'm not saying they're terrible people or are painfully stupid to not get this, or any of that stuff, I'm just saying I think they happen to be wrong on this one example. And a part of that is probably due to the general cultural cynicism that has understandably developed towards films nowadays. Yes, I think the film is fine. It's fine. It's not as interesting a review when you just say that, is it? Maybe that's part of the problem. The film ends with Indy waking up in his home and Marion is there and Salah and Helena and Teddy, and I think it's partly supposed to feel a bit like he may have possibly returns to a slightly altered timeline, but also the point is clear. There always was a life for Indy there in the present, in the future. He didn't have to doom himself to the past. It's just he couldn't see it. He can now. That's quite a nice message to end a series of films all about a man digging up the past. And again, the execution is definitely lacking, but in concept, it's nice. And if I'm wrong, it's only fair you tell me so in the comments, or tell me what I've missed or misunderstood, or maybe like the video, subscribe, possibly support me on Patreon. Otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Luke Hoare, Treat Chukaba, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Billy Lee Myers Jr., Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell and Michael Hart. Thank you.